Hi, Mike Brantley, auctioneer. Just released a blog here recently about good faith deposits or earnest money deposits taken by auctioneers, typically real estate. We've sold a lot of real estate at auction, and we would typically require back in the 90s and early 2000s, sometimes like a $2,500 earnest money paid upon being deemed the high bidder. And we'd record that in the purchase contract, deposit in the broker's trust account per the contract. And in my state of Ohio, and probably a few other states, have done something very prudent, which is that that money's not released unless one of four particular things happen. First of all, the two parties, buyer and seller, agree to release it, called a mutual release. Number two, a closing. That's even better. We close the deal, money can be released. That's in essence a mutual agreement. Third, a court order. If a court orders it released, a broker would have no choice but to follow that court order. And number four, what's called a sheet, which is that it reverts and or goes to the state. In my state of Ohio, our sheet laws say if that money sits in the broker's trust account for 2 years and is accounted for properly and that kind of thing, that it can go to the state of Ohio. So I offered that those were really excellent ways to manage good faith or earnest money in the broker's trust account, a real estate broker's account, or an auctioneer broker trust account, because it's not always easy to tell who's breaching the contract and who is due the earnest money. As I offered in this blog, maybe the buyer doesn't show up for a 4 o'clock closing because his email said it was at 5 o'clock. But he doesn't show up at 4 o'clock, and so they say, well, he breached the contract, here's the money. He shows up at 5 and says, well, I got an email that says 5 o'clock. Or seller said they would leave the refrigerator. So the buyer maybe walks over or prior to the closing, just for a pre-closing inspection, that type of thing, 24 hours ahead of time, says, well, the refrigerator's not here. Seller breached the contract. Broker says, yep, not here. I guess I'll give you your money back. When the refrigerator isn't in the kitchen, the refrigerator is in the garage. See, it's not always clear, even if it is seemingly clear. I don't think brokers and auctioneers ought to get in the business or be in the business of deciding which way, what direction that earnest money or good faith money goes based on one opinion, seller's opinion or buyer's opinion. And so I think our rules here in Ohio are perfect. They took effect in 2017. Prior to that, Ohio allowed, and many states probably do today, allowed a liquidation clause in the purchase contract. If the buyer breaches, it goes to the seller. If the seller breaches the contract, it goes to the buyer. The thing is, how do we know who breached, and are we sure who breached? And so this new system since 2017 has worked a lot better in our state, and I would suggest that you manage it in a similar fashion. Maybe take that liquidation clause out and maybe put in these statements that the broker will retain this deposit unless or until there's mutual agreement, there's a closing, there's a court order, or so much time passes and we're going to put it in the essentially an unclaimed fund or state fund. Some auctioneers say, well, you know what, Mike, I fixed that. We don't call it a good faith or earnest money deposit. We call it a down payment. And the down payment can be handled differently. Well, let's talk about these terms. Earnest money or good faith is used to induce or prescribed per the auctioneer as money needed to secure the deal between the buyer and the seller. Earnest money is between the buyer and seller. Good faith money is between the buyer and seller. Down payment is typically what a buyer and a lender negotiates. So I'm buying the property and I talk to my lender and I get pre-approved or whatnot, get things lined up, and I say, and I'm going to put 10% or 20% or a fixed amount as a down payment, and I'm doing that between myself, the buyer, and the lender. in attempts to get either pre-qualified or maybe to get if I put more down, I could probably get a better interest rate, better terms. That's not really between the buyer and seller. That's between the buyer and the lender. So I guess my initial opinion is that as an auctioneer and a broker, it doesn't make any difference whether you call it earnest money, good faith deposit, or down payment. If it's between the buyer and seller, it might be today, subject to that liquidation clause in the purchase contract. A better place would be for it to not be included there, I believe, and have one of those four things happen. If it's a down payment, that isn't provided at the contract signing. That's in the contract that will be paid to the seller at closing. See, you don't need a loan if you're not closing, so the down payment would be triggered by a closing, and the lender says, okay, and you're bringing so much down payment, and then we're funding as a loan the balance. So I don't know that by changing the terminology, that we're really changing the prudence of not having a liquidation clause in the purchase contract, sale, purchase, whatever you want to call it, between the buyer and seller, and rather have either terms in that contract or state law that prescribes otherwise, that it can be released with a mutual agreement, with a closing, with a court order, or within so many months or years, lays unclaimed. So that would be my view. This is obviously a state issue for the most part. So your state may look at it differently. Maybe your state uses different terms, but my impression from teaching real estate classes around the United States, for the most part, earnest money or good faith deposits are between the buyer and seller. Down payment is between the buyer and the lender. Mike Brantley, Auctioneer. Pleasure to be with you today. Other videos on this same page, others forthcoming. Have a great day and stay safe.